The morning always began the same way for Ethan Callahan. Long before the sun even hinted at rising, he was awake, pulling on his heavy wool coat, boots stiff with wear, and gloves that still carried the faint scent of leather and hay. The world outside his window was silent, but for the low hum of wind moving across the fields, carrying with it the sharp bite of winter. The snow had been falling off and on for weeks, blanketing the ranch in a white stillness that seemed endless. For Ethan, it was just another day, another season in a life that never changed. He stepped out onto the porch, breath curling into mist, boots crunching against the packed snow. The stars above were fading, the sky turning from black to deep gray. It was the coldest part of the morning, when the earth felt like it might crack under its own frost. Ethan pulled his hat lower over his brow and made his way to the barn. The animals stirred when he entered, the warmth of their bodies immediately contrasting with the chill outside. The scent of hay, manure, and leather filled the air, a smell he had known since boyhood. His cattle shifted and huffed, their breath steaming in the lantern light. Ethan worked without hurry, but without pause, pitchfork in hand, moving hay into troughs, checking water buckets to make sure they weren't frozen over. He patted the flank of a cow as she leaned in for her feed, murmuring a few low words, though no one but the animal would ever hear them. This was Ethan's life, steady, predictable, and quiet. There was comfort in the rhythm. Repair a fence, check the herd, mend what was broken, repeat. While other men sought adventure or fortune in the towns and cities, Ethan had chosen, or perhaps been chosen by, a different life. He didn't mind. The land was enough for him. By mid-morning, the sun managed to break weakly through the clouds, turning the snow into a bright, blinding expanse. Ethan was outside, hammer in hand, driving a new board into a broken section of the corral fence. His hands were calloused, his movements precise. Every job had its place, every chore its time. He didn't waste words, and he didn't waste effort. The nearest town was 10 miles away, and he only went when necessity demanded. Supplies, tools, the occasional sale of livestock. When he did ride in, the townsfolk always greeted him politely, but there was a distance too. They called him the lonely rancher. Some said it kindly, others as a whisper of pity. He had no family left, no wife waiting by the fire, no children running in the yard. Only the ranch, the cattle, and the silence of the plains. He heard the whispers sometimes when he stopped at the general store. That Callahan boy, still out there all by himself. A fine man, but strange, keeping to himself like that. He didn't care much what they thought. Loneliness wasn't something he feared. It was something he understood. The land gave him purpose, and that was enough. By evening, Ethan returned to the barn one last time, checking the animals before the night deepened. The wind had picked up, rattling the roof and sending snow drifting in high waves across the yard. The sky was heavy with clouds, promising another storm. He made sure the doors were latched, the animals settled, and then trudged back to the farmhouse. Inside, the house was as plain and practical as the man who lived there. A wood stove burned in the corner, casting a steady heat. Shelves lined with jars of preserves and sacks of flour showed his careful planning for long winters. A single armchair sat near the fire, the fabric worn smooth. That chair had been his father's, and now it was his. Ethan sat down with a plate of beans and bread, eating in silence. The crackle of the fire was the only sound, the shadows flickering on the walls. He leaned back, staring into the flames, letting his thoughts wander only a little. Some nights he thought of what it might be like to have a voice across from him, someone to share the silence with. But those thoughts always passed quickly. He had chosen this life, and he accepted it. The storm outside began to grow louder. Wind howled against the windows, rattling the shutters. Snow hissed across the roof, the air growing colder even inside the house. Ethan rose, tossing another log onto the fire, watching sparks leap up the chimney. He pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, a habit he kept even indoors when the storms grew fierce. He thought again of the townsfolk, of the way they looked at him sometimes, curious, almost sad. But Ethan told himself he didn't need the world beyond his ranch. He had weathered winters before, and he would weather this one. The ranch was his life, and that was enough. He moved to the window, looking out into the black night. Snowflakes swirled like ghosts in the lamplight, the world disappearing under white. He was about to turn away when he thought he heard something, a faint sound, nearly lost in the storm. A thud, a scrape, then, unmistakably, a knock at the door. Ethan froze, hand still on the curtain. Visitors never came out here, not in weather like this. He waited, listening. The knock came again, louder this time, desperate against the roar of the wind. His jaw tightened. For the first time in a long while, the silence of his ranch had been broken, and with it, his life was about to change. The storm raged with a ferocity Ethan hadn't seen in years. Wind lashed against the wooden walls of the farmhouse, and snow piled higher by the minute, blurring the line between earth and sky. The knocking came again, quick and urgent, nearly lost in the roar of the gale. Ethan set his plate aside and rose, every muscle tensed. No one came out here, not in weather like this. He crossed the room in long, steady strides, boots thumping against the floorboards, and pulled the door open just enough to see who it was. The wind caught it instantly, flinging it wider, snow spiraling into the entryway. Through the blinding white he saw her, small, trembling, wrapped in what had once been a fine coat now torn and soaked through. Her dark hair clung to her face in wet strands, cheeks flushed from the cold. Her eyes, wide and desperate, locked onto his, as though he were the only thing standing between her and death. "Please," she gasped, voice shaking. "Please, let me in. I need to sleep here tonight." Ethan blinked, taking in her words, her appearance, the sheer impossibility of her being here. She looked nothing like the hardy ranchwomen he'd seen in town. She was a city woman through and through, delicate gloves torn at the fingertips, boots made for walking streets, not trudging through snow. Without hesitation, he grabbed her arm, firm but careful, and pulled her inside. He slammed the door against the wind, bracing his shoulder to hold it shut until the latch caught. For a moment, the two of them stood in silence, the storm muffled behind thick walls, their breaths clouding in the air between them. She shivered violently, her lips pale, her teeth chattering so hard it was a wonder she could speak at all. But she did, words tumbling out in a rush. "Please," she whispered again, clutching the front of her coat. "I don't have anywhere else to go. They'll find me. If I sleep with you, they'll think I'm safe. It's the only way." Ethan stared at her, stunned into stillness. He had expected a traveler lost on the road, maybe a neighbor caught in the storm. But this? A woman speaking of danger, of sleeping under his roof, as though it were a matter of life and death? It didn't make sense. "You'd better sit by the fire," he said at last, his voice low and gravelly from disuse. He guided her toward the chair nearest the stove, where the warmth licked out in steady waves. She dropped into it, her body curling in on itself, hands extended toward the flames. Ethan fetched a quilt from the back of the room and draped it around her shoulders. She startled at his touch, then clutched the fabric tightly, pulling it close as though she feared it might vanish. Her eyes glistened, not just from the heat thawing her frozen lashes, but from something deeper, fear that clung to her every movement. "What's your name?" Ethan asked, standing a few feet away, unsure how close was too close. "Clara," she breathed, still trembling. "Clara Bennett." He nodded slowly. "Ethan Callahan." He shifted his weight, the name of his ranch unspoken. Because out here, it didn't matter. What mattered was why she was here. "You said, someone's after you." Clara flinched, her gaze flicking toward the window as though shadows might be pressed against the glass. "Yes," she whispered, "they followed me from the city. I thought I lost them, but I know they'll come. They always come." Ethan studied her silent for a long while. He was not a man who wasted words, but in the heavy quiet of the room, he understood she needed more than silence. "You're safe here tonight," he said finally. Her eyes lifted to his, brimming with tears that hadn't yet fallen. "But if they see me here alone, if they think I don't belong to anyone, they won't stop. That's why I said, sleep with me. Pretend. Please." The weight of her words settled in the air, strange and sharp. Ethan's jaw tightened, his mind caught between shock and a kind of raw protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. She was terrified, desperate, and though her request rattled him, he understood what she meant. Not an invitation born of desire, but of survival. If she appeared to be under the protection of a man, these pursuers might hesitate. He looked at her for a long moment, then turned away, stoking the fire to give his hands something to do. "You'll stay here," he said. "That's enough." She opened her mouth to protest, but his tone left no room. Still, there was no harshness in it, only certainty. He would keep her safe, though neither of them knew yet how. The hours stretched on, the storm battering the house, the wind singing through the chimney. Clara dozed in the chair, exhaustion dragging her under despite her fear. Ethan sat nearby, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the fire. He could hear her breathing steady, could see the tension in her face ease as sleep claimed her. For the first time in years, Ethan wasn't alone in the silence. The sound of another heartbeat, another breath, filled the room, changing it in ways he couldn't name. When the fire burned low, he rose, moving with quiet care. He lifted Clara into his arms, her weight feather light, her head lolling against his shoulder. He carried her to the small bedroom, laying her on the bed, tucking the quilt around her. She stirred, murmured something half-formed, and clutched at his sleeve before slipping deeper into sleep. Ethan stood there, watching her, something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. He had never asked for company, never sought it, and yet here it was, dropped on his doorstep by a storm. He stepped back, returning to his chair by the fire, where he sat the rest of the night, listening to the storm's fury and the faint sound of her breathing through the door. When dawn broke, the world outside was buried in white. Snow lay heavy on the fences, the barn roof sagged under its weight, and drifts piled against the porch. Ethan pulled on his boots and coat, preparing for the morning's work, but before he stepped outside, he glanced once toward the bedroom door. Clara was still asleep, her presence changing the quiet in ways he had not yet begun to understand. And though he did not say it aloud, he knew the storm had brought more than snow to his doorstep. It had brought a change he could neither predict nor avoid. Ethan rose before the sun, as he always did, though this morning felt different. The storm had eased, leaving behind a world smothered in white. Snowdrifts climbed nearly to the windowsills, and the fences looked like faint lines carved into an endless plain of white. The air was sharp enough to sting the lungs, and frost clung to the inside edges of the windows. Inside the house, the silence was broken by a sound Ethan hadn't heard in years. Soft footsteps, hesitant and careful. Clara had risen. He glanced over his shoulder from where he stood at the stove, frying salt pork in a heavy iron skillet. She appeared in the doorway, wrapped in the quilt he had given her, hair mussed from sleep, cheeks flushed from warmth instead of cold this time. For a long moment they simply looked at one another. She seemed uncertain, as though she wasn't sure she belonged there, and perhaps she didn't. But Ethan only nodded toward the table. "Sit, food's near ready." Clara hesitated, then crossed the room, lowering herself onto the wooden chair as though the simple act of sitting down at his table was a luxury. Her eyes wandered the room, taking in the plain furnishings, the sturdy shelves, the worn armchair by the fire. "You live here alone," she said softly. Ethan flipped the pork, the smell filling the room. "Always have." "No one comes to see you?" "Not often." He slid the meat onto a plate, cut thick slices of bread, and set it in front of her. He poured coffee into 2 mugs, sliding one across the table. Clara wrapped her hands around the mug, holding it as though it were precious. She sipped carefully, her eyes closing briefly at the warmth. "Thank you," she whispered. They ate in silence at first, though Ethan found his eyes drifting toward her more than once. She ate slowly, each bite small, as though she feared the food might vanish if she wasn't careful. When her shoulders began to relax, some of the tension leaving her frame, Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You gonna tell me why they're after you?" Clara froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. For a heartbeat, she didn't breathe. Then she set it down carefully, her hands trembling just enough for him to notice. "I worked for a man in the city," she said finally, voice low. "He wasn't kind, not to me, not to anyone. I saw something I shouldn't have, something he wanted kept quiet. When I tried to leave, he sent them after me." Her eyes flicked to the window, to the endless sweep of snow. "They'll never stop!" Ethan's jaw tightened. He didn't know the ways of city men, but he understood cruelty. He'd seen it in the hard winters, in the wild, in the way the world could break a person down. And he saw it now, in the fear that clung to Clara like a shadow. "You're safe here," he said, his voice steady, certain. Clara's gaze snapped to him, searching his face for doubt. She found none. For the first time since she'd arrived, her shoulders eased. The days stretched on, the chores waiting no matter who was under his roof. Ethan pulled on his coat and boots, preparing to face the cold. But when Clara rose as well, he frowned. "You don't need to come out there," he told her. "I want to help," she insisted. He studied her delicate boots, her thin gloves, and nearly refused. But there was a determination in her eyes that stopped him. Finally, he nodded. "Stay close. Don't touch the fences unless I say so." Together they stepped into the morning, the snow nearly swallowing Clara's small frame. She gasped at the cold, pulling the quilt tighter around her shoulders, but she trudged on after him. In the barn, the warmth of the animals surrounded them, the lowing of cattle, the rustle of hay. Ethan moved with practiced ease, tossing feed, checking water troughs. Clara stood uncertainly at first, but when he handed her a small bucket of oats for the horses, she carried it forward, scattering the feed with careful hands. The horses nickered, pressing their noses to her palms. Clara laughed, the sound bright and unexpected in the dim barn. Ethan paused, watching her, something in his chest tightening. He hadn't realized how empty the place had sounded until that laugh filled it. "You treat them like family," she said, stroking a horse's muzzle. "They're all I've got," Ethan replied. Her smile faded, and she looked at him with something softer in her eyes. "Not anymore," she whispered. The words lingered in the air long after they left her lips. As the days passed, Clara settled into the rhythm of the ranch. She learned to gather eggs from the hens, to carry wood to the stove, to sweep snow from the porch. She asked endless questions, her city-bred curiosity both amusing and exhausting. Why did the cattle huddle together that way? How could he tell when a storm was coming? Did he ever feel lonely out here with no one to talk to? Ethan answered when he could, shrugged when he couldn't. But he found himself talking more than he had in years, words coming easier in her presence. He told her about his father who had built the ranch with his own hands, and about his mother who had died when he was young. He told her about the winters that nearly broke him, and the springs that saved him. And in turn, Clara told him about the city, about crowded streets and gas lamps, about music spilling from windows, about dresses finer than any he'd ever seen. But beneath her stories was always a shadow, the memory of the man she had fled, the danger that still lingered. At night they sat by the fire, the silence between them no longer heavy but comfortable. Sometimes Clara sewed the tear in her coat. Sometimes Ethan mended a rope or sharpened a tool. But always their eyes found each other, as though drawn by some quiet force. Still, the threat was never far. One evening, Ethan stepped outside to fetch more wood and paused, his gaze narrowing on the snow near the fence line. Tracks. Too large to be an animal, too fresh to be from before the storm. His hand went to the rifle propped by the door, his body tense. When he returned inside, Clara looked up, her smile fading at the hardness in his eyes. "They're close," Ethan said simply. Her hands gripped the quilt, knuckles white. Fear flickered in her eyes, but beneath it was something else, a trust that he would keep her safe. And Ethan knew, in that moment, that he would. no matter the cost. The ranch that had once been only his refuge was now hers as well. And the silence that had once been his shield was now broken by her voice, her laughter, her presence. He had never asked for it, but now he couldn't imagine the ranch without her. The danger was coming. He could feel it in his bones. But for now, as the fire crackled and Clara's breathing steadied beside him, Ethan let himself believe in the fragile peace they had built, and in the unspoken promise that he would fight to keep it. The wind had shifted again, carrying with it the warning of another storm, though this time the cold was not what gnawed at Ethan Callahan's bones. It was the unease. He'd spent too many years on this land not to know when something was wrong, when the quiet of the plains wasn't a quiet he could trust. The tracks he'd found near the fence line 2 days before still haunted his thoughts. He had erased them with his boots, but he couldn't erase the truth they carried. Clara's pursuers had come close, too close. Inside the barn, he pushed fresh hay into the stalls, the cattle crowding close, their lowing deep and restless. Animals felt danger in ways men often overlooked. He glanced over his shoulder more than once, hand brushing the rifle that leaned against the wall. Clara stood nearby, her breath visible in the cold air, arms wrapped tight around herself. She had insisted on helping again, though Ethan had argued. Her stubbornness had become something he expected. At first she had moved with hesitation, a city woman unsure of herself, but now she carried buckets and scattered feed with a determination that impressed him more than he let on. Still, he didn't like the fear he saw in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. "Ethan," she whispered, voice carrying just above the rustle of straw, "what if they find us here?" "They won't," he said quickly, though the words were more for her comfort than his own certainty. "Not if I can help it." Clara pressed her lips together, searching his face as though she could read the truth in his eyes. Whatever she saw there made her shoulders ease, just slightly. By the time they returned to the house, the sky had darkened, clouds rolling heavy, promising snow. Ethan set the rifle by the door, laying kindling into the stove until the fire burned bright. Clara moved quietly around the room, her presence now woven into the fabric of his life so seamlessly that he couldn't remember what the house had felt like before she had come. She paused by the window, her hand resting on the sill. "When I was a girl, I used to dream of places like this," she murmured. "Of silence, of land stretching forever. I thought it sounded like freedom." "And now?" Ethan asked, watching her. She turned, eyes shadowed. "Now it feels like hiding. I don't want to spend my life running, Ethan." "You won't," he said, his voice low, steady. He meant it, even if he had to fight every man in Wyoming to make it so. The storm came faster than he expected. By nightfall, the wind shrieked through the eaves, rattling the shutters. Snow hurled itself against the house, burying the porch in white. Clara sat near the fire, mending her coat with tiny, careful stitches, though her gaze kept flicking toward the door as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. Ethan stayed by the window, the rifle across his knees, his eyes scanning the darkness. He told himself it was the storm making the shadows shift, the wind playing tricks on his ears. But deep down, he knew better. Near midnight, when Clara had finally dozed in the armchair, a sound cut through the howl of the storm. Faint, but there. Hoofbeats. Slow at first, then stopping. Ethan's body went rigid. He rose silently, pulling on his coat, cradling the rifle in one hand. At the door, he hesitated, looking back at Clara. She stirred in her sleep, the firelight casting her face in soft lines, shadows dancing across her closed eyes. For a moment, he wanted nothing more than to leave her in peace, to pretend the night held no danger. But that wasn't the truth. He opened the door just enough to peer into the storm. Snow stung his face, the wind stealing his breath. Through the white curtain, he saw them, 2 dark figures on horseback, cloaked against the storm, waiting just beyond the fence line. They didn't move closer, didn't call out, but Ethan knew they were here for her. His grip on the rifle tightened. Behind him, Clara's voice broke the silence, thin and frightened. "They're here, aren't they?" He turned. She was awake now, standing, her quilt slipping from her shoulders, her eyes wide and glistening. "Yes," Ethan said simply. Fear flickered across her face, but alongside it was something else. a raw trust that hit him harder than any storm. She believed in him, and for that, he would not fail her. He closed the door, bolting it. "Stay here. No matter what you hear, you don't open that door." Her hand shot out, gripping his sleeve. "Ethan, please, don't go out there." He covered her hand with his own, rough fingers enveloping hers. "I'll keep you safe. That's a promise." The words were plain, but they carried the weight of his soul. He stepped back into the storm, the rifle steady in his hands, the snow crunching beneath his boots. The two riders shifted, their horses snorting, restless. One of the men lifted a hand in greeting that carried no warmth. "Even in, rancher," the man called, his voice muffled by the storm but sharp enough to carry. "We're looking for a woman. You seen her?" Ethan's jaw clenched. He lifted the rifle, not aiming yet but close enough to show he meant business. "Ain't no women here but my wife." The lie rolled off his tongue with surprising ease, but the truth in his heart made it stronger. The men exchanged a glance. "Your wife, huh?" The second rider chuckled, the sound ugly. "Funny, she don't look like the marrying kind." Ethan took a step forward, the barrel of his rifle gleaming in the faint light. "Then you don't know her like I do. She's mine, and she's staying here. You best turn around." For a long moment, the only sound was the storm raging around them. Then the first rider spat into the snow. "You'll regret this, rancher." With a tug on their reins, the two men wheeled their horses and vanished into the night. Ethan stood there long after they were gone, the snow stinging his skin, his heart pounding. He knew this wasn't the end. Men like that didn't give up easy. When he finally stepped back inside, Clara rushed to him, her hands clutching his arms as though to make sure he was real, that he was whole. "What did you tell them?" she whispered. "That you were my wife," Ethan said, his voice low, steady, her breath caught. For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy with something neither dared name. Then, Clara pressed her forehead to his chest, her body trembling, and Ethan wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. The storm howled outside, the danger still looming. But inside the farmhouse, in that moment, there was only the steady beat of his heart and the fragile hope that somehow, together, they could face whatever came next. The storm broke by morning, leaving the world covered in a silence that felt almost holy. Snow lay in heavy drifts across the ranch, the air sharp and still. Smoke rose from the farmhouse chimney, curling into the pale sky, and inside, Ethan Callahan sat at the edge of the table, his head bowed, his hands wrapped around a mug that had long since gone cold. Clara moved quietly around the room, the hem of her skirt brushing the wooden floor. She hadn't slept, not really. Every time the wind rattled the shutters, she started awake, her heart pounding with the memory of the men outside. But when she looked at Ethan, sitting like a sentinel through the night, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Safe. She stopped beside him, laying a hand lightly on his shoulder. "You didn't close your eyes all night." "I wasn't tired." His voice was rough, but not unkind. He lifted his gaze, meeting hers. "They'll be back." Her throat tightened. She knew he was right. The men who hunted her wouldn't be scared off by one warning. They would return, and next time they wouldn't wait at the fence. Ethan rose, the chair scraping softly against the floor. "I'll fix the north fence today. If they're smart, that's where they'll try to come through." "I'll come with you," Clara said quickly. He turned, brows furrowed. "Too dangerous." "I can help," she insisted. "You can't do all this alone. And if something happens out there, I'd rather face it with you than sit here wondering if you'll come back." For a long moment they stood in silence, her eyes steady on his jaw tight. Finally he nodded once. "Stay close to me." The day was bright but cold, the sun glaring off the snow. They trudged across the yard together, their boots sinking deep, breath curling in white plumes. At the fence line, Ethan set to work, hammering boards back into place, his movements strong and practiced. Clara stood nearby, handing him nails, holding the wood steady when his hands were occupied. It was simple work, but it bound them together in a way neither had expected. "You've lived here your whole life," Clara said after a while, her voice carrying across the still air. Born here, raised here, and I'll die here, I reckon. He drove another nail into the board. Don't you ever wonder what's beyond all this? She asked, her gaze sweeping across the endless white fields. The world out there is so big, loud, alive, and here. She trailed off, unsure if her words were insulting. Ethan glanced at her, his eyes narrowing slightly against the glare of snow. Here's enough for me. Clara looked down, chewing her lip. I used to think the same thing about the city, that it was all I needed. But now. She hesitated, then lifted her gaze to his. Now I'm not so sure. Their eyes held for a long moment, the air between them charged with something unspoken. Then Ethan looked away, returning to his work, though his hands moved slower than before. That evening, after the chores were done and the cattle settled, they sat by the fire. Clara stitched at the seam of her coat, Ethan sharpening his knife. The ordinary sounds, the scrape of steel, the snap of the fire, were oddly comforting. But beneath it all lingered the memory of the riders, the threat that hung just beyond the walls. Ethan, Clara said softly, setting her sewing aside, what you told them last night, that I was your wife. He stilled, the knife pausing in his hand. Slowly, he set it down, his eyes lifting to hers. It was the only way to make them back off. I know, she whispered, her fingers twisted in her lap. But when you said it, I believed it. For a moment, I let myself believe it was true. Ethan's breath caught. He leaned forward, his elbows braced on his knees, his eyes dark and searching. And if it were? Her heart pounded so hard she thought he might hear it. She swallowed, her voice trembling. Then I wouldn't be afraid anymore. The firelight flickered across his face, shadows deepening the lines of his jaw, the sharpness of his cheekbones. Slowly, carefully, he reached across the space between them, his rough hand closing around hers. Her fingers fit against his as though they had always belonged there. Neither spoke for a long time. They didn't need to. But the fragile moment shattered when a distant sound reached them, a gunshot, muffled by the snow but unmistakable. Clara gasped, clutching his hand tighter. Ethan was already on his feet, grabbing the rifle from its place by the door. Stay inside, he ordered. No, she whispered fiercely. Not this time. Before he could argue, she was already pulling on her coat, her eyes blazing with fear and determination. Ethan swore under his breath, but he didn't waste time. He threw open the door, the two of them stepping out into the night together. The snow crunched beneath their boots, the cold biting hard at their skin. Another shot cracked through the air, closer this time. They moved toward the barn, Ethan in front, Clara just behind, her hand gripping the back of his coat. When they reached the fence line, they saw them. 3 riders this time, not 2, their horses restless, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats and scarves. One of them lifted his rifle, aiming it toward the barn. Ethan didn't hesitate. He raised his own and fired. The shot rang out, echoing across the frozen land. The rider jerked back, his hat flying off. Though whether from a wound or a warning, Ethan couldn't tell. "Get off my land!" Ethan roared, his voice carrying with a fury Clara had never heard before. The men shifted uneasily, muttering to one another. One spat into the snow, glaring. "This ain't over, rancher." With a tug on the reins, they wheeled their horses and vanished into the darkness, their silhouettes swallowed by the storm. Ethan lowered his rifle slowly, his chest heaving. Clara clung to his arm, her breath ragged. For a long moment they stood there, the snow falling soft and silent around them, the danger receding but not gone. Finally, Ethan turned to her, his hand cupping her face, rough thumb brushing her cheek. "I won't let them take you, not while I'm breathing." Tears slipped down her cheeks, hot against the cold night air. She pressed her forehead to his chest, her hands fisting in his coat. "Then don't let me go," she whispered. And in that moment, Ethan knew he never would. They returned to the house, the fire still burning, the warmth wrapping around them like a promise. Clara shed her coat, sinking into his arms, as though she had found the only place she truly belonged. Ethan held her, his hand in her hair, his heart pounding with a fierce, unshakable certainty. The storm outside had passed, but another still loomed, and they both knew it. The men would come again. The danger wasn't gone. But together, they were stronger than either had been alone. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Callahan, the lonely rancher, realized that his ranch was no longer just a place of silence and work. It was a home, because she was in it. The night stretched on, filled with the crackle of the fire and the steady rhythm of two hearts that had finally found one another. Whatever storms waited ahead, they would face them side by side, and neither would ever be alone again. In the heart of a Wyoming winter, Ethan Callahan, once known as the Lonely Rancher, found the warmth he never knew he was missing. Through fear, storms, and danger, Clara brought light into his silence, and together they discovered that love is the greatest shelter of all. Their bond, forged in the fiercest of nights, proved that even in the wildest frontier, the heart always knows where it belongs. If you enjoyed this heartwarming tale of love, courage, and the untamed spirit of the West, make sure to subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles so you never miss another story of passion and adventure under the wide frontier skies.